Dark Souls 2, a game that most people either love or hate. I am in the former camp. Dark Souls 2 was the last game that I played in the series, but I really wish I tried it sooner. I was put off from the second installment in the franchise by the community, and fully believed it was terrible, or at least the worst in the series, for some time. Oh, how wrong I was. This video is a personal critique of what many consider bad mechanics, but also a defense of the design choices that led to this masterpiece. Yes, it is flawed, but I wouldn't have it any other way. Let's start off with my personal experience with the Soulsborne games, and Souls-like genre as a whole. Like for many people, Elden Ring was my entry into the genre. I bought it in 2023, but bounced off it at Market, deleting the game and wishing I could get a refund. The following year, however, after getting into Iron Pineapple's Steam dumpster diving series, I decided to pick it back up. This time, I played it through to completion and loved every second. From there, I watched lore videos, challenge runs, and did several more playthroughs of my own before resolving to play the rest of the series. Since then, I've played Bloodborne, Dark Souls 3, Sekiro, Dark Souls 1, Demon Souls, the original, not the remake, Sekiro, and finally, Dark Souls 2, in that order. Dark Souls 2 is often regarded as the weakest FromSoft title. The common complaints include the slower nature of the game, the boss design, the hitboxes, the runbacks, and, the most prevalent, the newly introduced ADP stat. I would counter those fairly valid arguments with the quality of the level design, enemy encounters, build variety, and story. But before I get to glazing the game, let's address the negatives. First off, the speed of Dark Souls 2. Comparatively, DS2 is a much slower game, by far the slowest of the Dark Souls series. However, this isn't really an objectively bad thing, as it is a matter of subjective taste. DS2 is not slow or clunky for the sake of it. It is simply a much more methodical game. Every attack, or even step, in DS2 is deliberate and intentional. These slower animations, paired with far lower amounts of stamina than players had in its predecessor, makes dodging, taking things slow, and learning the game much more important, and forces you to engage with mechanics on a deeper level. Panic rolling will get you nowhere in this game, and even more so than in other Souls titles, even the weakest enemies are a huge threat to an untrained hollow. In other words, the pace of DS2 isn't a poor game choice or even a criticism, but a mere preference. Now to the boss design. I will concede somewhat here and say that, on average, Dark Souls 2 has the least fun bosses. Although I wouldn't consider any bad, they are low tier when it comes to the standard that most hold FromSoft and Miyazaki to. However, I did say on average, when a boss is good in this game, it's really good. Take Velstadt, Mytha, the Pursuer, Fume Knight, or Sur alone. As many have brought up, it would seem that some are comparing the best bosses of other games to the worst of this one. Artorias versus the Covetous Demon was never a fair matchup. What's more, I'd like to point out the hypocrisy in these criticisms when looking at DS1, a universally beloved game, whose bosses are not on average any more in-depth or fun than DS2's. It's important to compare this game not to modern games like Elden Ring, but to remember on what foundation it was built on. The hitboxes of DS2 are pretty bad. I'm not going to tell you to get good or talk about leveling ADP. They are some of the worst in the series, and it often feels as though you are hit mid-dodge roll, or when the boss hasn't even moved. This, coupled with the fact that for some inconceivable reason, your lock-on doesn't actually lock you on, makes some already mediocre fights into terrible ones. Maybe From Software should have spent more time on this, and less on modeling the Emerald Herald's feat. The runbacks in DS2 are always talked about as a main drawback to the game as a whole. And sure, in theory, running back to a boss every time you die while dodging enemies sounds terrible. But the truth is that you won't be running back to a boss very often. The bosses in DS2 are on the easier side, and most of the time you'll defeat them within a few tries. Without these arduous runbacks, they would each take less than 10 minutes, if I had to guess. Mind you, I'm not particularly good at Souls-likes, despite my experience. I'd also like to point out that these runbacks are a conscious decision. Unlike Elden Ring, for example, where some encounters are blatantly unfair, since FromSoft assumed players would simply run past them, the philosophy when designing DS2 when it came to non-boss fights was to encourage the player to attempt these encounters and slay all enemies in an area rather than ignoring them. This can be seen in the more thoughtfully designed areas, the fact that enemies will follow you forever, unlike in the previous game, and the inclusion of life gems, common and effective healing items dropped by nearly everything and used in addition to players' Estus. The idea behind these additions was that the player would be prepared to beat the area boss by the end of exploring a level. While I agree that this could have been better implemented, it succeeds in making each area feel like an adventure. ADP. Oh boy. Every Souls veteran watching this video just shuddered. For those who don't know, ADP, standing for Adaptability, is a newly introduced stat in DS2, which affects your character's resistances to things like poison, as well as, most infamously, the speed at which you roll and drink from your flask. At first, this sounds great. If you're struggling or simply want to, you can level the stat that makes the two core mechanics of the game, dodging enemy attacks and healing with a potion, much easier. That is, until you realize that the trade-off is having much slower animations for these actions at the start of the game. In order to get your dodge roll iframes to the same as they were in the previous game, you will need to invest upwards of 20 to 25 points into the ADP stat. This is a huge downgrade from the previous system, and a nightmare for people trying to min-max their builds, as it forces you to invest valuable stat points into an otherwise negligible category. Though I didn't have any problems with this on my playthrough, as I leveled mostly dexterity and endurance, and welcomed another category to put unneeded points into, I can easily see how this might affect more complex builds, such as magic, faith, or darkness build, all of which need to level much more stats. However, while I do dislike its inclusion in the game, I would also like to mention the stat Vigor. Vigor in Dark Souls 1 and 2 is not the same as it is in the other games, where it determines your health. In the first two Dark Souls games, Vitality, a separate stat, determines your health, while Vigor determines your equip load, or how many things you can carry. In other games, Endurance controls stamina and equip load, but in these, it is only stamina. This strange Vigor stat is equally as confusing and redundant, but left out of the argument. This shows how many people hyper-focus on ADP as the main problem with Dark Souls 2, and while it is an issue, it has been blown entirely out of proportion, and never affected my enjoyment of the game. Now, finally, we can move on to the positives. First of all, the level design. Dark Souls 2 blows every other Souls game out of the water entirely when it comes to this. Every single area is interconnected and detailed, and you are constantly rewarded for exploration and curiosity with useful and valuable items. A case in point for the former and latter is the first level of the game, the Forest of the Giants. Cardinal Tower is most likely the only bonfire that you will find in the central area, but a second one would prove unnecessary, as every time you go down a different path, it leads back to the tower, where you can open up a shortcut in order to return there faster. In addition to this, you are rewarded for exploration. If you go down the buildings outside the tower and fight off the enemies, you will be rewarded not only with souls and consumables, but a fire longsword, one of the best early game weapons. Furthermore, from the very start of Dark Souls 2, you can explore a multitude of areas, in any order, rather than being railroaded onto a single path, like in Dark Souls 3. Hade's Tower of Flame, the Gutter, and the aforementioned Forest of the Giants are all areas you can explore from the very start. Finally, this section would not be complete without mentioning Majula, the backdrop for this video. This is by far the best hub in any Souls-like game, and it's not even close. Even DS2 haters will bring up Majula as one of the strengths of the game. The beauty and calming soundtrack serves as a great reprieve from adventuring, and the decision to force you to return here to level up was masterful. More than once, I was sweating, hoping to find a bonfire before I lost my souls, only to sigh in relief when the hub area's theme then played. Also, just look at the dragon's eyrie. Just look at it. I don't even have to say anything. Enemy encounters in this game are not only fair, but fun, and I would venture to say that I enjoyed them more than the boss fights on most occasions. The enemy variety keeps you on your toes, and their thoughtful placement assures that they are never a slog to get through. Another point towards why this game is a masterpiece is its build variety. In the series, only Elden Ring tops the amount of different characters you can play, and even that is a very close race. There are so many subtypes even to the subtypes, making it one of the most replayable games I've ever played, and once you've beaten it once, subsequent playthroughs are much faster and easier, allowing you to experiment with a multitude of different weapons and armor. On the armor, it is perhaps the most varied and colorful of all three Souls games, and has some of the most memorable sets in the series, in my opinion. Lastly, the story. I'll try not to spoil it too much, as I hope I've convinced some of you who have yet to play it to do so. But to those who have played, the moment when you meet Vendrick says it all. DS2 achieves the most melancholic vibe in a series based on melancholy, and there's something to be said for that. That's basically it. Dark Souls 2 is flawed, sure, but it's also, in my opinion, the best in the series, and deserves far more love than it has gotten over these years. From the Shrine of Amana to the Lands Betwixt, it truly is a masterpiece. Thank you all so much for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I'd really appreciate it if you subscribed. I'm making more Dark Souls content, and if you got here, I'm sure you'll like it. Good luck out there in Drangleic. Stay safe, and don't you dare go hollow.